Welcome back to the Deep Dive. You're here because, like us, you want to get past the headlines, really understand things.
Exactly.
And today, we're tackling, well, a pretty significant and complex subject. The Crips.
Yeah, definitely complex. We've been looking through various sources, historical texts, social analyses,
Yeah.
trying to piece together the story.
Our mission, as always, is to pull out the really key insights, the interesting bits about their history, their activities, the whole context.
Right. And the baseline, what we found is, the Crips are primarily an African-American alliance of street gangs based mainly in Southern California,
California, okay.
specifically Los Angeles. They got started back in 1969
1969.
Wow.
by two main figures, Raymond Washington and Stanley Williams.
Okay, so L.A., 69, Washington, and Williams.
Got it. Now, one thing people always wonder about, I think, is the name itself, Crips. It's memorable.
It is, yeah, where it came from. Well, there are a couple of main theories floating around in the sources.
Okay.
One idea is that they first called themselves the Crips.
Yeah, like CRIBS, supposedly to reflect how young a lot of the members were back then.
Huh. Young kids, so Crips.
Kind of. And the story goes that this changed to Crips when some members started carrying canes.
Canes. Why? Like an image thing?
Maybe. The sources suggest it led to people calling them cripples as a nickname. Maybe half-jokingly, maybe not.
Right.
And cripples then got shortened down to Crips. It's interesting how that could happen organically.
Yeah, language is weird like that.
And we know the Los Angeles Times actually started using the name Crips in print around February 1972. So that shift, if it happened that way, happened pretty fast.
72. Okay. That's one theory. What's the other one?
The other one links it back to an earlier gang from the 1970s in Watts. They were called the Cripplers.
Cripplers. Okay, more direct.
A bit, yeah. And Raymond Washington, one of the founders we mentioned, was apparently part of that Cripplers group.
Ah, okay.
So this theory suggests Crips just evolved naturally from Cripplers. No big hidden meaning initially.
So less about the canes in young age, more just a shortening of an existing name.
Pretty much, which kind of debunks some later ideas, like that whole backronym Common Revolution in Progress. The sources suggest that was probably made up later.
Right, trying to add meaning after the fact.
Exactly. But what's interesting about both theories is what they kind of show about how these identities form,
How so?
Well, the Crips to Crips idea highlights how, outside perception or even just member behavior carrying canes can shape a name.
Right, how others see you.
Yeah, and the Cripplers connection shows this wasn't totally out of the blue. There was a history and evolution of street gangs already happening.
Okay, so we've got the founding, the name possibilities. But to really get why the Crips emerged then and there, late 60s LA, we need to look at the background, right? The context in South Central.
Absolutely crucial. You got to look back, even starting after World War II.
Post-war, what was happening?
Well, you see this economic shift, a decline, really, in areas like South Central. Fewer jobs, rising poverty.
And that hits communities hard.
Especially African-American communities who were already dealing with systemic discrimination,
Yeah.
Fewer opportunities, economic stress. It creates a tough environment.
Makes sense. Limited options.
Yeah. And it can make other kinds of social groups, maybe outside the mainstream, seem more attractive to young people looking for structure or belonging.
And it wasn't just economics, was it? Segregation was a huge factor.
Huge. Racial segregation meant young Black men were often shut out of mainstream organizations. Think like the Boy Scouts, for example, things that provide social networks.
Right, so if you're excluded from those...
You create your own. That's where you start seeing the rise of Black street clubs.
Street clubs. Not quite gangs yet, maybe?
Not necessarily in the way we think of them later, but yeah, they filled that gap, provided community, identity, a sense of belonging that was missing elsewhere because of that exclusion.
It's like if the main doors are closed, you find another way in or build your own room.
That's a good way to put it. It's about finding that social capital, that connection somewhere.
Okay, so you've got economic pressure, social exclusion, creating these clubs. Then what happens as we get closer to 69?
Well, the 60s also saw big shifts in Black activism. You had powerful groups like the Black Panther Party, the Black Power movement, hugely influential.
Right.
But by the late 60s, early 70s, their, let's say, widespread prominence started to decline somewhat for various reasons.
Okay.
And that might have left a bit of a vacuum, especially for younger people still facing all those same issues, poverty, racism, but maybe without those same large-scale organized political outlets.
So the focus perhaps shifted. from broader political goals to something else.
Possibly. It seems the gangs that emerged, like the Crips, were often more focused on immediate local stuff, territory, survival, disputes with other groups right there in the neighborhood.
Yeah, Stanley Williams himself, one of the founders, said in his memoir, right, that the Crips weren't like an offshoot of the Panthers.
Exactly. He was clear they didn't start with some big political agenda. He framed it more as a defensive thing, an alliance to protect themselves against other street gangs that already existed.
So it's this mix then. Economic hardship, the legacy of segregation leading to street clubs, and maybe a gap left by the changing face of activism.
All converging in South Central LA around 1969.
That's the environment they grew out of. It wasn't random.
Not at all. It was a response to specific historical, social, economic conditions. Understanding that is key to grasping everything that came after.
Right. The growth, the rivalries.
The whole culture, it all builds on that foundation.
Okay, so we've covered the origins, the name theories, the context. Now let's talk about that growth, because they didn't just stay a small LA thing, did they?
Oh, definitely not. What started as that local alliance in '69 just exploded. By 2015, the info we have suggests estimates of around 30,000 to 35,000 members.
35,000, wow.
Yeah, spread across something like 800 different sets.
Sets, those are like local chapters, right?
Oh.
Different neighborhood groups.
Exactly. Each often with its own turf, its own identity, but under that broader Crip umbrella. And crucially, not just in LA anymore.
Where else?
The data suggests a presence in 41 U.S. states by that point.
41.
And even outside the U.S., Canada, Montreal, and Toronto specifically. And Belize.
Belize, okay. That's a massive expansion.
It's remarkable and, yeah, concerning too. And unfortunately, that expansion went hand in hand with involvement in serious crime.
Yeah, the sources list a lot. Drug trafficking is a big one.
Especially with the rise of crack cocaine in the 1980s, that became a major engine for them.
Right. Money and power.
Huge amounts. And it fueled further expansion as sets sought new markets. But also, yeah, things like murder, assault, theft, burglary, extortion. The list is long and grim.
It paints a really stark picture of the impact on communities.
No question. That crack cocaine epidemic in the 80s particularly, the sources really emphasize how much that changed the game. It provided the resources and the incentive for that huge geographic spread.
And you can't really talk about the Crips without talking about their rivals, right? Specifically the Bloods. That's probably the most famous gang rivalry there is.
Absolutely inseparable, yeah. And that rivalry, according to our sources, started pretty early on.
How early?
Late 60s, early 70s. Apparently, it stemmed from early Crip members attacking other students, other groups.
Okay.
And those groups then banded together for protection, forming opposing gangs, like the Pirates, who became a foundational part of the Bloods alliance.
So the Bloods formed partly in reaction to the Crips.
That's what the history suggests, yeah. A direct response to perceived Crip aggression and expansion.
And that initial conflict just spiraled.
Completely. It laid the groundwork for decades of really intense, violent conflict, responsible for so much tragedy, not just in LA, but wherever both groups ended up.
But it's not just a simple Crips versus Bloods thing, is it? The sources mention a lot of fighting within the Crips network, too.
Oh, absolutely. That's crucial to understand. Crips isn't one single unified gang with a leader at the top. It's more like a loose confederation of these sets.
And the sets fight each other.
Often, yeah, violently. Over territory, respect, drug trade, internal politics, all sorts of reasons.
Any big examples?
Yeah, the sources highlight a really nasty war between the Rollin 60 neighborhood Crips and the 8-Tray gangster Crips. This apparently kicked off, or at least escalated significantly after Raymond Washington died.
The founder's death triggered infighting.
It seems so, which really shows you how decentralized it is. Local loyalties often trump that overarching Crip identity.
So it's fragmented.
Very. And sometimes things get really complicated. We even see mentions of Crip sets teaming up with Bloods.
Wait, Crips allying with Bloods?
Against other Crip sets, yeah. It highlights how fluid and localized these conflicts and alliances can be. It's not always straightforward, blue versus red.
That's intricate. A real web. And speaking of alliances, there were some other, maybe surprising ones mentioned, especially in prison.
Right. Prison dynamics are different. Sources talk about the 8-Ball Alliance.
8-Ball. Like in pool.
Exactly. Named after the black and white ball. It was an alliance formed in prisons, mainly in the Midwest and South, between the Crips, who are predominantly black, and the Folk Nation Alliance, which includes many white gangs.
Why team up? Protection?
Pretty much. Mutual survival inside, strengthened numbers against other prison factions. It shows how pragmatic these things can be when you're incarcerated. Shared circumstances, overriding street beefs.
Does that alliance hold up outside prison?
Sources suggest it's much stronger inside, less so on the streets where the old rivalries often reemerge.
And there was a whole list of other potential allies and rivals, too, wasn't there? It got confusing.
Yeah, the lists were long and sometimes overlapped, which again speaks to the complexity. Allies mentioned included groups like the American Mafia, Black Guerrilla Family, Gangster Disciples, even Juggalos, Tiny Rascal Gang, Latin Kings People Nation. A real mix.
Juggalos. Wow. Okay.
And then the rivals, besides the Bloods, included the Aryan Brotherhood, but also, interestingly, some groups that were also on the ally list, depending on the context.
Like Latin Kings People Nation.
Exactly. Tiny Rascal Gang, United Blood Nation, Venice 13. They appear on both lists in the sources we saw.
So it really depends on where you are, which specific sets are involved.
Precisely. It's super localized and dynamic. Alliances can shift. Conflicts can erupt between groups that might cooperate elsewhere. It's not monolithic at all.
Okay, that makes the complex picture a bit clear.
Hmm.
Let's shift to culture. What are some of the unique cultural things associated with the Crips? The most obvious is probably the color blue.
Right. Blue clothing is the classic identifier, and the sources suggest that tradition started around 1973.
Any reason why blue?
Apparently, it was a tribute to a founding member named Curtis Morrow, nicknamed Buddha. He supposedly favored blue clothing.
So honoring a fallen member led to the whole color identity.
Seems that way. And it became a really powerful visual marker, obviously standing in contrast to the Bloods red. It's that visual language of belonging, you know?
Definitely. What else? Any linguistic things?
Yeah, some interesting stuff there. Certain Crip sets developed this practice of, like, disrespecting the letter B.
Because of Bloods.
Exactly. So they might cross it out when writing, or just avoid words starting with B if possible,
Huh.
and also avoiding the letters CK together.
CK.
Why?
Stands for Crip Killer.
Ah, so they substituted.
Yeah, often with CC. So a word like kickback might become kickback, or block becomes block.
It's like creating their own code almost.
It really is. It reinforces that in-group identity, signals affiliation to those who know the code, and subtly disses rivals. Language as a tool.
That's fascinating. And there was one more historical detail about language, Swahili.
Oh yeah, that was interesting. Apparently back in the 70s and 80s, some incarcerated Crips used Swahili to communicate.
To keep conversations private. Exactly, from guards and also from rival inmates. Just shows a level of ingenuity, adapting like that in prison, finding ways to maintain privacy and security.
Okay, so wrapping this up, we've gone from the specific conditions in late 60s LA that birthed the Crips.
Right, the economic hardships, segregation, the shift in activism.
Through the name origins, their massive expansion across the U.S. and beyond.
Fueled partly by the drug trade.
Looked at the intense Bloods rivalry, but also the internal Crip conflicts.
And those complex, sometimes surprising alliances, especially in prison.
And finally touched on some of the cultural markers, like the color blue and those linguistic quirks.
It's a lot to unpack, and the whole story really is a powerful, if often tragic, example of how these social structures emerge and evolve, shaped by bigger forces, economics, politics, history.
It's a complex web,
Yeah.
definitely not just a simple story of gangsters. There are layers of community, conflict, adaptation.
For sure. Woven into the fabric of certain urban environments for decades now.
Which brings us to our final thought, something for you, our listeners, to chew on. Given this whole history, we've discussed the origins, the evolution. How do you think those local socioeconomic factors and historical currents are still shaping groups like this today?
Yeah, and what are the ripple effects? For communities, for law enforcement, how do they deal with these dynamics that are constantly shifting?
Definitely something to think about. It goes way beyond just this deep dive.